With the inevitable release of the next DLC, we'll undoubtedly see an emphasis on Lizardmen and Skaven, especially with both lacking their Regiments of Renown, and now the only two races in the game without proper Regiments of Renown. And we've gone into some possible options for the Regiments of Renown for Skaven, like the Deadly Albino Skaven, and if you didn't catch that video, you can click the card in the upper right portion of the screen somewhere to watch that video as well. But today, we're going to crack some cold ones with the boys to talk about the Lizardmen. Now, unlike most of our other Regiments of Renown videos, this one will be based almost entirely on units that were showcased during the end times. To put that into perspective, certain armies in the tabletop had special heraldry and uniforms books, the Empire, High Elves, and Skaven to name a few. And the same cannot be said about the Lizardmen. They, like the Tyranids of the 40k universe, suffer from a certain trouble when writing from the respective species' perspective, since the society is highly individualized with relatively low autonomy. Now, using the Thankful book from End Times as our guide today, we can flesh out some of the possible contenders for Regiments of Renown. The way this will work is, we'll cover the very minor lore about each unit, then go into what their possible mechanics might be. Again, this will be pretty baseless speculation, as there's no special unit card to go off of, or anything to give me a hint about what their abilities might be. So, bullshit. Strictly speaking, I'm going to be using bullshit to talk about everything here today. So perfect, let's go. And let's start at the bottom of the ladder with the Skinks. We'll save red-crested Skinks for their own entry. Now, clearly, there would have to be two options here, right? For the Skink Skirmishers, we'd be looking at the Mist Runners, the slimy servants of Zlanhopek that cover their eyes in pale blue lotus to help blend in with the fog. In fact, they're all colored pale gray and blue. That's one thing to really take a look at here. This Regiment of Renown is going to be like a weird fashion show. The Lizardmen have finally broken up with their ex, and now they can wear their skimpy clothes out to Dave & Buster's. So we can expect a lot of different and fun variations of colored scales for these Regiments of Renown, as that's kind of part of what really sets them, well, apart. The Mist Runners, I'd assume, would be very simple. A Skink Skirmisher unit with stock and maybe an additional attribute on top of their poison attacks, maybe Discourage. And these Skinks lay in wait around the shrouded city of Zlanhopek, coming out of the mists to attack them, which I would imagine would be very discouraging to the wayward human that stumbles upon the temple city. As for the melee counterpart, let's take a look at the Yellow-Crested Cohort. In the lore, this is a mix of both Skinks and Croxagores, but I got the big Croco Dundees already covered, and I needed a plain Skink Cohort variant, so this makes sense. These are the fleeing remnants of the Ararat Monument of the Rising Sun. Of course, that hasn't been destroyed in this timeline by the Skaven, but we'll just kind of work around that. These Skinks are adorned with brilliant yellow crests, and they possess an everlasting hatred for any and all plague monks. What we have to look at with these Regiments of Renown is some trends, or at least things that overlap. So with that in mind, I would assume we're going to see some mechanics for the Lizardmen that include immune to poison, but also Regiments of Renown that hail from maybe Zlanhopek or Hexwaddle, and some of the other major temple cities with legendary lords that we're familiar with, such as Mazda Mundi coming from Hexwaddle. But back on track here, with their hatred for plague monks, I could see the yellow-crested Skinks as being immune to poison, and maybe even having Frenzy to speak to that overzealous need to destroy vermin. Sort of a diet version of a proposed red-crested Skinks that we're about to talk about. Since we're on that subject, we'll move into that hypothetical Regiment Renown from a hypothetical unit, the red-crested Skinks. Now, depending on what we get from these little dudes mechanically, the Regiments Renown could vary a ton. My speculation is that we'll see an AP immune to poison and stalking unit of little reddish, skittish lizards. That's my proposal, I guess you could say, for red-crested Skinks. Which plays out quite nicely into what I have in mind for the Redshields, a unit of red-crested Skinks that immediately join the Red Host under 10-1. Their lore tells of how, after emerging from the spawning pools of Axolotl, they made their way to the Red Host, and in the process, they slew a mighty Fangadon, creating their famous red shields from the hide and scales from that beast. And I think that's a pretty cool and apparent connotation, anti-large, with maybe a charge defense versus all. This way you have a unit that has access to AP and anti-large for an infantry unit, which is only seen on the Temple Guard. I mean, you do have Lizardmen Saurus with spears, but they don't have AP. And I'd love to see some sort of awesome kill animation where these guys kind of climb over all over like a creature and swarm them. That's kind of like a pipe dream, I suppose, but I just think that'd be kind of a really cool way to use skinks to swarm over a large creature. I mean, hopefully we'll get some sort of cool large baddies that we can get some sort of cool animations or kill animations with, and they've done a lot of really awesome stuff with that. But let's move over here to the next one. And there's a joke I can make about pipes, but I'll leave that on the table as a segue into the Chameleon Skinks, our little stalking poisoned harassment unit of the Lizardmen bros, with foreskin for eyelids. Now, I think it's hard to do a Regiment of Renown for these guys without making them too broken, and even my suggestions feel a little broken, and that's just, I guess, the way it's going to be with Regiments of Renown. But with no access to a proper fast cav, I think that there are some things we can work with here. The Eyes of the Canopy are a unit of Chameleon Skinks that guided the Red Host and 10-1 through the many hidden and shrouded paths towards Itza, sparing the Prophet of Sotek's army both time and casualties en route. Also, if you have car trouble, they got a guide. They appear as these glowing orange poison frogs, so a vastly different look to our normal Chameleon Skink unit, and a definite standout if done right. My idea for these guys are pretty simple. For one, the standard Chameleon Skink's speed is 48, far faster than most units on foot, but only slightly faster than some monstrous units. A simple speed increase would go pretty far in helping to make these guys even more of an annoyance. In addition, perhaps a poison that was either more potent than the base poison or their own standard concoction, something that's maybe like speaks directly to them as special variants of Chameleon Skinks. They do look like poison frogs, so giving them poison and melee would be a cool feature, but the standard edition of Chameleons already have that. I'd love to hear some of your ideas for how their poison could possibly be souped up. You know, a bound ability could be an easy solution, perhaps a poison spit. There's plenty of ways to do this one. Moving up the size scale, Saurus Warriors have a lot of variants, right? 4 base variants doesn't necessarily mean we'll have 4 corresponding Regiments of Renown. When we look at the Warriors of Chaos, for example, you have 3 variants, but only 1 Regiment of Renown. And I think we'd be looking at the same thing here for the Saurus. Orange-tipped crests herald the next of our Regiment of Renown, the Cohort of the Copper Sun. Now, there isn't any profound lore or really cool abilities that these guys have, so I think that maybe making this a unit of slightly more armored Saurus Warriors would be appealing, maybe even an AP attribute as well. This way you have a scrappy melee unit that is meant to tear apart armor, but without the focus of being anti-large. Typical Saurus have an armor of 60 and a melee defense of 34, while Temple Guard have 85 armor and 38 respectively. Perhaps 70 armor and 38 melee defense, as I imagine this would be the Saurus Warriors with Shields variant, making for a tankier armor-cracking unit that isn't focusing on halberds. Now, they could do 2 Regiments of Renown here and use the Cohort of the Black Club for an AP Spearman unit, but we haven't seen this done in previous iterations. Perhaps with the Lizardmen having a bit smaller of a roster as far as infantry goes, this could make sense. But Temple Guard also have an interesting predicament. You can make Regiment of Renown Temple Guard, which drops a halberd for a club shield variant, maybe even one with 2 clubs that is anti-infantry focused. The Honor Guard of Hexawaddle acts as the direct guardians of Lord Mastamundi himself, their dark scales topped with light blue crests. The biggest problem with dropping their halberds is that it's very uncharacteristic of the Temple Guard from a lore perspective, right? Dual club anti-infantry could be better suited to maybe a Saurus Warrior unit, now that I think about it, to be totally honest with you. Maybe that should be above, and we should be talked about in the Saurus Warrior portion. But perhaps the Cohort of the Black Club could have been like that, right? So either way, the Honor Guard of Hexawaddle could be imbued with special magical traits from their Slann masters, or giving them magic attacks, something of the sort. Their other ability is kind of a no-brainer. Guardian. I mean, these guys were tasked with safeguarding their respective Slann master. And some would go centuries without moving as the Slann mage priests hibernated on thoughts of the old ones. So Guardian just makes the most sense as an innate passive, granting that 18% physical resist in a 30-meter range around the unit. I mean, it's a surprising thing to me that the Temple Guard don't already have that, or maybe even some watered-down version of it, because it just feels so innately built into their profile and who they are. And with how Guardian has just been... It used to be a pretty rare ability in Warhammer 1 races, and now with Warhammer 2 races and their respective Regiments of Renown, almost every single unit almost every single army has one unit that has a Guardian on it. I mean, you even take a look at Bretonnia, they have Guardian on their paladins as well as another unit. So I think that bringing Guardian to the Lizardmen makes the most sense, and it makes the most sense on Temple Guard. And as we move away from the smaller Lizardmen, well, by small by comparison, have you guys ever seen the older art of Saurus? They're fucking massive. Same thing with a Black Orc by comparison to a man, just pure beefcake. Kroxigors, though, are the king of beefcake. They've had a weird place in the kind of competitive meta since the game has come out. Having high mass, great access to AP, and being the general linebackers of the army, Kroxigors are still rather low in their speed as well as their weapon strength compared to similar units and or similar monstrous units of their size. Couple that with their primal instincts, Kroxigors can be a real hamstring if not protected or used properly. The Shrouded Cohort is a special formation including both Skinks and Kroxigors, just like the yellow-crested Skinks above. But defending the mist fields of Zonhopek, the Shrouded Cohort would pop out from subterranean cave systems to flank or rear charge their foes, while using the same cave system to retreat in defense of the city if needed. The lore of the Shrouded Cohort leans pretty heavily on the notion of maybe a stock mechanic, which, while weird for a Kroxigor unit, could be really helpful. Hear me out on this. Regiment of Renown typically, or Regiment of Renown units as a whole, typically get bursted down very quick, whenever you're playing a multiplayer match at least, right? So take, for instance, the Night Terrors Regiment of Renown unit of Mourngulls for the Vampire Coast. Bursted down in a second, they can regenerate, they've got hunger, they're scary. Stock would ensure a really solid delivery system for these giant synthesis of local man from Florida and a crocodile. In lieu of stock, removing the rampage mechanic would help the survivability of this unit, as that's one of the main cruxes of the Kroxigors. Since they're a low unit count, they can get focused down to rampage very quickly, and from there, they can be pretty hard to deal with as a Lizardman player. And especially if they're not engaged in combat, they can just be all willy-nilly all over the place. And outside of one or other of those two mechanics, giving these guys Sunder armor to effectively act as a unit of Famir would be an interesting addition for the Kroxigors. And you could use them in the same way as you would a Famir, right? Saurus Charger unit, supported by the Sundering armor of this Kroxigor Regiment of Renown. Not entirely original, I will admit, but it's something I could see as hugely useful to the Lizardmen and a different way to play Kroxigors that kind of lends itself to the way that we already see people playing with monstrous units in conjunction with normal infantry. Even the old school Warhammer 1 tactic of having Grave Guards supported by Crypt Horrors. It's that kind of mirroring approach that we've seen with a lot of other armies. But just how Kroxigors with Romulan cloaking devices could be useful, so could this next Regiment of Renown. Tichi Huichi's Raiders. Now this is a special unit of horned ones, not cold ones. What makes them so special? Well, they're all skinks. This is actually a unit from Tabletop, so we have rules to go off of for this one. Now I couldn't come up with something this smart, guys. I mean, skinks on horned ones, I haven't taken enough mescaline to make that connection easily. But I think it works, and it could be a lot of fun. The lore behind this unit is pretty cool too. As we all know, all Lizardmen come from spawning pools, and sometimes those spawning pools produce abnormalities that are taken as a direct sign or calling from the old ones. An example would be that spawning pool producing a singular albino Saurus rather than an entire unit. This gentle Lizardman would become Gorak and was destined for greatness and the second he exited the pools. And in this case, Tichi Huichi witnessed the spawning of a skink, or skinks, that were oddly marked, elaborate head crests marking them as favored by the god of beasts, Itzel. In the older lore, skinks were the ones that rode horned ones, or the only ones that rode horned ones, as they were the only ones that could tame them. In addition to their elaborate crests, that is, the skinks were covered in patches and random vermilion markings, the red color showing their favor to the will of Sotek. And a thought dawned on Tichi Huichi, an epiphany as it were. He traveled down to the ancient caverns below the ruined temple city of Ensalada, which I swear sounds too conveniently close to enchilada. All the Lizardman names are a pun of some sort. Then he discovers a spawning to match the skinks, horned ones with the same vermilion patches on their skins. Huichi took this as a sign that he was destined to lead the specialized unit of horned ones. Now, this is an old Dogs of War unit from, I think, like 6th or 7th edition, but it's a really cool and flavorful one. How could this be translated to Total War, though, right? That's the big question. And I think it could be done quite easily. I'd love to see these as a sort of Regiment of Renown skirmisher cav. Not the heaviest of armor, but a great mobile shock cav platform. They're still horned ones, so they'd be decent in melee, but their skink mounts ensures that they're more agile than they are armored. They have rules, and I think that those rules can make an easy 1-to-1 conversion here. First off is Blessed by the Old Ones, and this was a rule that dealt with pursuing the unit after combat in tabletop, but I could simply see this as a built-in physical or ward resist, maybe a 25% physical resist as the defense of the Old Ones shields the Red Skinks, or it could be a watered-down shield of the Old Ones, which gives 22% damage resist, so maybe the watered-down version that we're talking about does like 11% damage resist. In addition, you have the ability On a Mission from the Gods. This actually erased stupidity from the Horned Ones, which would mean that a unit could actually not attack if they failed their stupidity check in tabletop. It was pretty brutal. I see this as erasing the rampage mechanic from the Horned Ones as a whole, much like the Knights of the Ebenclaw are on Horned Ones and don't rampage. The same could be said for Tichi Hoichi's Raiders. What this does is enables a rather durable, fast cav unit that will also not run the risk of locking down with a rampage mechanic. But since we've started talking about the dinosaur portions of the Lizardmen, let's keep that trend going with the Bastiladons now. Looking at other lists, we typically don't get a Regiment of Renown for each and every type of larger monster in their roster. It's 1 or 2, rarely 3. Now, I thought the Dread Saurian as a possible Regiment of Renown for the Feral Carnosaur, that would be pretty nifty, right? But I think we all want the Dread Saurian as its own unit with its own rules. So I'm going to focus on the Bastiladons. There's one unit called the Living Bastions, I almost said Living Bastiladons, Living Bastions, which is a twin set of Bastiladons that are both wearing an Ark of Sotek, spilling little tiny snakes all over the place to piss off Indiana Jones. And this would then be the Regiment of Renown version of the Ark of Sotek flavor of Bastiladon. But since that unit isn't in the game, and it's really, we're speculating on both a unit that is not there and this Regiment of Renown, this could mean a lot of stuff here. We've talked about how the Ark of Sotek would give an effective short-range AoE poison ability that's either an aura, a bound ability, or something else. But how could the Ark of Sotek benefit from a Regiment of Renown? I mean, it's a pretty straightforward unit. So I thought of adding buffs rather than making the unit itself stronger or different, like a Blessing of Sotek that bestows poison damage on a unit, similar to the Norscan War Shrine bestowing Unbreakable and fire attacks. In addition, maybe it could grant a passive bonus to leadership, as this thing is meant to be in combat, so its aura would directly be beneficial to the rest of Lizardmen around it. This is another tough one for me, and honestly, I'd love to hear what you guys think, and just kind of get an idea of what your thoughts are on how heavily individualized monster like this can be tweaked for a Regiment of Renown. It always kind of feels cumbersome when you're dealing with something like this that has like a very specific niche in and of itself. Just again, like the Norscan War Shrine, you're now adding more stuff to it, and it's like, okay, what do I add to it without just making this kind of like a cheese Regiment of Renown? That doesn't mean I don't have ideas for other beasts, though. Pterodon Riders are one of the first things we saw of Lizardmen in their live-action trailer. You know, skinks running wild in the air, fun to be had for all. The Sky Cohort is a special group of Pterodon and Riperdactyl riders led by none other than Tic-Tac-Toe, the Master of Skies, out of Hexawaddle. Now, if Tic-Tac-Toe were added as a possible FLC choice, then these guys would fit in perfectly with that narrative. These lime green flavored Pterodons would act as a great excuse for a Regiment of Renown unit. Looking at the standard Pterodon, not the Fire Bola unit, we see a pretty decent fighter with its typical ranged poison attacks. The Regiment of Renown unit of the Sky Cohort needs to maintain that ranged air superiority. They're better combatants than the Hawk Riders, just lacking in AP. And I think that flying AP has to be relegated to the Riperdactyl, so we'll leave that off for this unit. Instead, I could see magic range attacks built into the profile of the Sky Cohort, and even an increased speed capability. One thing I'd be super interested in would be an ability to maybe negate Tempest or Howling Warp Gale, maybe a passive that increases the miscast chance, or even an outright immunity. That would make for a very strong harassment unit that can't be locked down as easily, or pulled out of the sky, or just focused by all the range fire that Tempest and Howling Warp Gale usually invite. But since we did bring up the Rippers, let's go into another hypothetical Regiment of Renown for another hypothetical unit. Now, assuming we get Riperdactyls, and they're the high weapon strength AP challenge to air superiority that I see them as, we could have something unique in the Wind That Hungers, a squad of Ripperdactyls serving in the Red Host that single-handedly tore apart a Skaven patrol without riders on them. Now, this is unique, as we've talked about how Ripperdactyls are notoriously hard to tame, but these guys landed and allowed red-crested skinks to just mount them without issue. No big deal. Go ahead, go for it. Now, another themed Red Host and Red-Crested unit, this could be a unit of Ripperdactyls with stock, which would be pretty deadly. I don't believe we have a flying unit of this caliber that does have a stock mechanic, so it could be a great way to get them in close to get the jump on something. Now, we could also see the typical immune to poison I'd expect from any Red-Crested unit, but even further, the ability to deliver a Sunder Armor or even Discourage to make them even more deadly on the charge. And I had thought of maybe even the ability to cause fear, but I believe that should be innate in the Ripperdactyls package, as it were. So maybe there are some other mechanics that can be built into this. It really depends on how they do the Blot Toad and how the Blot Toad plays into the Ripperdactyl, if they even touch on that, if the Ripperdactyl's even in the game. It just really depends on some of the stock benefits of the Ripperdactyls before you can really truly speculate on what the Regiment Renown version of that's going to be like. But with that, we've reached the end of our list of projected Regiments of Renown for the Lizardmen. Some others I could see that I didn't talk about would be a possible Regiment of Renown Stegodon, either ancient or feral, but no real big deal ones come to mind outside of maybe, Zlok. Another option too would be a Regiment Renown Cold One Spear Rider, which may also deliver another anti-large, or just put anti-large into their package, making them a true threat to large creatures. But hopefully, time will tell as we get closer to the suspected launch date of this DLC. As I was saying in my speculation videos, we might be looking at a mid-April launch window, so let's start our hype trains and see where this leads. I'll ride that poop train straight into hell with you guys. I'd love to hear some of the Regiment Renowns you guys would like to see, or even ones that I missed, so go ahead and comment below, let me know what your thoughts are on those. Maybe they're the ones that I just completely missed from older versions, or some White Dwarf article units, stuff like that. But as always, guys, thanks so much for watching here today. Have a good one and take care.